right, if I could please have your attention, we'll get started with our second panel, which is a discussion and debate on the role that cronyism has played in shaping the technology industry. Our moderator is the executive editor of The American Conservative, McCrary. He began his career in journalism at TAC as an editorial assistant and later senior editor. Before returning to TAC, he was the managing editor of The National Interest and a Robert Novak Journalism Fellow at the Fund for American Studies. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists.
Thanks so much, Johnny, and thanks to all of you for staying on. I'm not sure how we're going to match that rousing address by Ralph Nader, but I'm challenging all the panelists to try to inspire us all in that way. And I also realize we're now the only people standing between you and the happy hour that will try to begin promptly at 6. So we'll try to have a vigorous, hopefully, some debate and good discussion before we go out and continue the debate over some drinks. I'll just start by briefly introducing our panelists. You have their bios in your program, but I think we've assembled, especially my colleagues, and I want to thank Daniel Kishi, who's there in the back of the room, has been really instrumental in setting up this panel and getting all of our panelists here. And it's a really all-star lineup of folks. I think we'll, as I said, there maybe will be some disagreements, but I think we all agree that there's a fundamental problem of crony capitalism in big tech, and I think we're going to have a good discussion about that. So starting at the far end of the table is Matt Stoller, who's a fellow at the Open Markets Institute. He works on political economy and competition policy. He's written for a variety of publications, including The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Nation, and The Baffler, so we'll have to get him intact next. And he's working on a book on monopoly power in the 20th century that is going to be published by Simon & Schuster. Next to him, we have Tim Carney, who is the commentary editor at the Washington Examiner and a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. His recent book is called The Big Ripoff: How Big Business and Big Government Steal Your Money. And his other book is Obamonomics: How Barack Obama is Bankrupting You and Enriching His Wall Street Friends. I like actually all of our panelists, we'll get to the others, have great book titles that leave no doubt about what's in their books. Next to Tim, we have Robert Atkinson, who is the founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. His book is called Big is Beautiful: Debunking the Myth of Small Business and Innovation. And his second book, is Innovation Economics: The Race for Global Advantage. And then lastly, next to me, Stacy Mitchell is the co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which produces research and advocates for policies that counter concentrated power and strengthen local economies. Her writings appeared in The Atlantic, The Nation, and The Wall Street Journal. And her book the title is Big Box Swindle: The True Cost of Mega Retailers and the Fight for America's Independent Businesses. So we've asked our panelists to start by just making a few minutes of remarks on the issue of crony capitalism in big tech. Why don't we go in the order of the table? So we'll start with Matt and sort of move this direction towards me. So Matt Stoller, Open Markets Institute. Welcome.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me? Is this?
I think you might have to switch it.
Is this? Okay, great. They just didn't want to hear what I had to say. I thought that was funny. So I'm studying monopoly in the 20th century. I'm just going to go through a couple of stats on the big three, which is Google, Facebook, and Amazon. So Google has 88% of the search market. Facebook has 77% of mobile social networking traffic. Amazon has 74% of the ebooks market. 2/3 of American adults are on Facebook. 43% of them say that social networks are where they often get their news. Google and Facebook captured virtually all of the growth in online advertising last year. And Amazon took more than half of all online sales growth last year. So when you're I guess the joke I heard earlier today was when it's a right-winger, you call it crony capitalism, and when it's a left-winger, you call it monopoly. And I'm on the left, so I talk about it as monopoly. I think this is sort of one of those areas where Ralph Nader was talking about. You see a convergence between the right and the left. So I've been on Tucker Carlson a couple of times, and I pretty much disagree with everything on his show, except for when he talks about the tech platforms. And when I say tech platforms, I'm talking about Amazon, Google, and Facebook. And I asked him why, or we started talking about it. He said, you know, I'm a free market guy, or at least I used to think I was a free market guy. But something about these platforms kind of really scares me. It's different than anything I've seen before. Why do I feel this sort of skepticism? And you know, based on a lot of the research that I've been doing about how Americans have thought about monopoly over the past couple hundred years, it's because when you're looking at a monopoly, you're not looking at business. You're looking at a private government. And that's what I said. Because your sense of skepticism and fear towards a coercive government is triggered by these private governments. And he was like, yes, that's it. And that's how I tend to think about monopolies. And in particular, the tech monopolies are especially dangerous because they are monopolies over the flow of information among American citizens. So I'm going to read a couple of quotes from some conservatives. One of the things that I did was I studied the Chicago School of Economic Thinking from the 40s until roughly the 80s, and there were some really interesting trends. So Henry Simons, who's sort of one of the founders, he wrote, I think this was in a positive program for laissez-faire, political liberty can survive only within an effectively competitive economic system. Thus, the great enemy of democracy is monopoly in all its forms. Friedrich Hayek, in The Road to Serfdom, which is a great book that everyone likes to pretend they've read. I read it recently. There was a lot of really interesting stuff in there, and he talks a lot about monopoly. And in fact, the very first, chapter 1, the quote that introduces the chapter is actually a quote from FDR's speech on monopolies from 1938. So Hayek is talking about monopoly, and he says, "A state which allows such enormous aggregations of power to grow up cannot afford to let this power rest entirely in private control." And he was talking about, in the 1940s when he was writing the book, he was looking at Germany, he was looking at Italy. That's what he was looking at, the road to serfdom. This was his fear, and he saw concentrations of power in either the public sector or the private sector as essentially, in a lot of ways, indistinguishable. He was also opposed after the war to British socialists in particular, but also people like John Kenneth Galbraith, who in many ways is a founder of the thinking of the modern Democratic Party. And he said there must be some form of monopoly if industry is to be progressive. And a lot of the ways that our politics is organized within both parties, even today, is around the framework of big business, countervailing force, countervailing power, big labor, big government. And that took the place of what has traditionally been anti-monopoly policy throughout American history. And we're going back to the 19th century, even the 18th century. So the Enlightenment in America is probably one of the greatest creations of the Enlightenment, was framed around two concepts. The first was liberty, and the second was capitalism, and they're integrated. There was a reaction against the Enlightenment, and that was because of the violence that you saw in the 19th century. But the romantic reaction against the Enlightenment saw a belief that these functions, liberty and capitalism, cannot serve to create a good society. And what you saw was a lot of utopian ideas and a rejection of the idea that people can be free. And that utopian idealism never went away. And in a lot of ways, a lot of the conflicts that we've seen within societies and between countries over the course of several hundred years have actually reflected questions of utopia versus questions of the ability of all of us to have personal liberty with all that implies. You look at the way that the tech monopolies, and this is what I'm going to sort of end with, but if you look at the way that they think about themselves, when Mark Zuckerberg talks about making the world more open and connected, or the idea of organizing the world's information, or making an everything store, these are utopian ideas. These are ideas that are about restructuring the human being to these systems that can develop a better world, a utopian world. And that is what the Enlightenment was premised on rejecting. Enlightenment was premised on accepting humanity as who we are, as people who can govern ourselves with all that implies, both good and bad. So when we look at questions of monopoly, questions of particularly the ability to manipulate information among and between citizens, we have to recognize that these institutions represent something that we haven't seen in maybe 200 years since the British East Indies Company, which is a threat to our ability as citizens to govern ourselves.
Thanks very much. So, Tim, is big tech a problem? I imagine you have a bit of a different view.
Well, I think I'm going to, I think I'm going to agree half with Matt and half with John at least, and hopefully my third half with Stacy. I do think that we should be scared of Google, Amazon, and Facebook, but not because they are, because of the power they have now, but the power they could have from the combination of their market power now and political power. The most telling moment to me in the Facebook, in the Mark Zuckerberg hearings, was not sort of the entertaining technological ignorance of the senators. In some ways I had lots of sympathy for them because I still have to ask my children, I already have to ask my children how to change a channel on my television. My children are 11 and I'm not even 40. That's how fast technology is moving. But when he, first of all, he tries to posit that Facebook is a monopoly, and I thought Zuckerberg's responses that it wasn't a monopoly were half convincing. But then he says, do you think you should be regulated? Zuckerberg says, well, if the regulations are right, yes. Does Europe do it right? Zuckerberg says, well, Europe does some things right. Could you propose some regulations for us? And Zuckerberg says, absolutely. He sort of bounces up in his seat there. The big guys want to be regulated in part because they know they get to write the rules. The Google, Amazon, Facebook are the top 3 spenders in their industry on lobbying. I was just looking at it now. Amazon employs former Senators John Breaux, Trent Lott, former Congressman Norm Dix, and Vic Fazio. So that's right and left, both chambers. You've got Susan Molinari as a Google lobbyist, former Congresswoman, 18 million, 13 million. Facebook, I think might actually be down below 10 million, but I'm sure that will change this year. Most of their lobbyists are former congressional staff or executive branch officials. So these people, big government is an inside game for Google, Amazon, and Facebook. The more that government intervenes in these industries, the more that they have the advantage. They will get to write the rules. And the rules themselves will crowd out competition. One of the rules that Zuckerberg has proposed will require artificial intelligence software to weed out hate comments. Now, the idea of some bot weeding out hate comments, because I know that, you know, in a few years, half of the stuff said in the first 2 panels here could be considered hate comments, right? But then you think, that's expensive. And Zuckerberg says, well, we're already partway on the way to having this artificial intelligence develop. Regulation adds to overhead, and the big guys can afford the cost. And the regulation then protects, it builds what in the financial sector Jamie Dimon calls Dodd-Frank part of his moat, keeping out competition. And you see it, and big government, not just regulation, but also the spending. Who gets the handouts? I mean, the bidding process over Amazon's headquarters 2 is embarrassing. As a Marylander, the fact that we might get it, to me, is just shameful, that I will be paying taxes to enrich the richest man in the world to pay for his parking lot and his office building is shocking. Mom and pop don't get those sort of subsidies. Big government is a home game for these guys, and that's why to be scared of them, in my view. I will add this, though. I will give this to Matt. There's a difference. I think his last point about the utopian talk really is kind of scary. That entrepreneurs, a lot of times, what they want to do is change the world. But if you think about, say, an artist who comes in, and a lot of businesses who come in, you think about Nirvana, the band. So in the 1990s, like Rico Suave, I think, was the #1 hit on the radio when Nirvana came in and just smashed the music scene. And so forgive me, this was when I was in high school, so I remember this decently well. And then it changed the way that everybody else did it. And a lot of times capitalism is like that. The new guy comes in and changes the world, and everybody else has to adapt and do that. And so the market then pounds on it. If you're aiming to be the platform, if you want to be the everything store for everybody, if you want to be the hub through which everybody communicates with one another and the holder of all the data, then that does, so this is my note of sort of extra warning, then that in itself, that's a reason to be more concerned about these companies than you would be maybe about General Electric, changing the world with a light bulb and getting filthy rich off of it. That said, I do think the reason to worry about these big guys is because their bigness gives them more access to government, which then allows them to ask for bigger government, which then allows them to build this moat around themselves, and then you don't have competition. And as Matt said, without competition, when you have monopoly, the market's no longer serving the positive force that it's serving, and liberty itself is eroded. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. So we'll go to Robert Atkinson, who can tell us why big is beautiful.
Sure. Well, thank you, Louis. It's a pleasure to be here. And I guess I would just clarify, we don't all agree. Maybe 4 of us agree. I don't agree. I actually don't think there's tech cronyism. I would actually think we need a lot more support for U.S. technology companies than we have today. I think the odds of our U.S. losing its technology leadership and the jobs and innovation that go with it are quite high. I would imagine 20 years, maybe less, you're going to see a potential diminution of U.S. technology companies and jobs and replacement by Chinese companies if we don't do more. This is actually an industry that is marked, if by nothing else, then by almost the absence of government. Amazon headquarters thing is not unique to tech, and so we shouldn't even bring it up in the same argument. Every industry, when they want to locate a new facility, whether it's a headquarters or whatever, they engage in a bidding war. It's not unique to tech. I would also just, I can't resist from hearing Mr. Nader. I'd say one of the issues I think in this debate is sometimes we don't always look at logic and facts. I'm struck by the fact that if the defense industry is so craven and so powerful, why they are the 52nd most profitable industry in the United States. You would imagine it would be the most profitable. And we hear many of the same arguments around tech, which is why my colleague and Mike Lind and I wrote this book that I think is beautiful. Let me read you a quote. Matt read a couple of quotes. So about a century ago, the leading journalist, Dorothy Thompson, and she wrote, quote, "Two souls dwell in the bosom of the American people, the one that loves the abundant life as expressed in the cheap and plentiful products of large-scale mass production and distribution. The other soul yearns for former simplicity, for decentralizations, for the interests of the little man, denounces monopoly and economic empires, and seeks means of breaking them up." Sounds pretty familiar. So what is the real issue here? The real issue here is, do we want wealth, consumer welfare, really wonderful products? It's amazing to me how quickly people forget about this. We used to have to pay money to do text messaging, and then Amazon came along. When I go overseas or I'm on a trip somewhere and I have my 11 or 12, she's 12, I just turned 12, my 12-year-old daughter, she and I can video chat on my phone for free. And we couldn't do that a few years ago, for free. By the way, I have a question. How many people here pay between $10 and $20 a month for their Facebook subscription? Nobody? Okay. How many people pay per search when you use Google or Bing? Anybody? Okay. So we also have to remember, when we're talking about this, what we have, yeah, I'm sure. What we have to, when we're talking about this, what we have to remember when we have all this worry and freaked outness about market dominance is usually a problem when you have price issues. When things are free, you don't have price issues. So what is the real market for Facebook? It's not social networking. What's the real market for Google? It's not search. The market is ads. There is no evidence that there is an ad monopoly in the United States. Those two companies at most control about 25% of ad spend. So when you're Procter & Gamble and you got a whole lot of money and you want to say, where am I going to put it? Am I going to get taken to the cleaners by these internet monopolists? No, you're not. Because you can put it in a lot of different places. So just from that definition alone, we don't have a problem. The second thing I think is important to recognize, I'm not sure what this debate is about. I thought it was about crony capitalism, but it seems like it's about monopoly. Those are two separate things. Monopoly you can have without government involvement. Crony capitalism implies government involvement. Even on crony capitalism, which I hate the term because what that term really is meant by many people, probably many in this room, is anything the government would do to help the producer sector of the U.S. economy. Which, by the way, anybody here a worker? Anybody here employed? Okay, you are in the producer sector. Thank you. You are in the producer sector. So we are, most of us, unless you're retired, are consumers and producers. So there is no government in history that has not made efforts to help their producer sector. And if you want to call that crony capitalism, then you're basically consigning us to a fate of Argentina or maybe Venezuela. The question is what government doing to enable more innovation, more productivity, more competitiveness? Is it legitimate? And I have to say, when you think about the history of the tech industry, was it illegitimate for DARPA to invent the internet? God, think about all the profits that gave to Google. Look, if it wasn't for the government inventing the internet, we would not have the internet today. Last point, second last point. A lot of this discussion is about, oh my God, there are these monopolists and we should do something. How many people here on Facebook? Most people, great, okay, few. Imagine if the government breaks up Facebook and now we have Facebook and Headbook. Because, oh my God, wouldn't that be so much better for power and democracy? We don't have one monopolist, no more Mark Zuckerberg telling us what to do. How many people really want to have to post twice to Facebook and Headbook? The reason for these is because, as we read you a Council of Economic Advisors report from the Obama administration, quote, talking about this, quote, some newer technology markets are also characterized by network effects with large positive spillovers from having many consumers use the same product. We all benefit when we're all using Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or anything. Those net systems are much more valuable when we're all on them. If half of them are on them, they're less and less valuable. Therefore, they go on. Markets in which network effects are important, such as social media sites, may become dominated by one firm. The question then is, what does that domination mean? Is it problematic? And I think the answer is, no, it is not problematic. What it is worrisome. The difference between having a worry, having an anxiety, I don't like the fact that they have power. That's very different than saying there is an actual abuse of that power. I will challenge anybody on the panel here to give me an example, a specific example where these internet companies have abused, or telecom companies have abused that responsibility. Now you can argue, well, maybe Twitter shouldn't have kicked the Nazis off. Okay, were they abusing their power by violating free speech of the Nazis? Every one of those companies that's in that situation has to face a difficult situation every day. Where do they draw that line? Now, they don't draw the line, as I know some conservatives believe, they don't draw the line and say, well, we hate conservatives, we're going to keep them off the platform. They do draw the line on saying, I don't really think child pornography is okay, so I'm going to keep that off the platform. So the idea that we would somehow not want these companies to exercise some responsibility. And I understand that's worrisome. It sort of can freak you out if you're not careful, because they could do something. No question, they could do something. If Mark Zuckerberg wanted to, or if Google wanted to, they could manipulate the system. Why don't they, though? Many of you, I assume, are sort of free market types. Guess why they don't do that? Because number one, their reputational damage would be enormous. Facebook, by the way, is valued billions of dollars less, or hundreds of millions. I can't remember the number I just saw today, but I forgot it. Significantly less than it was before those hearings. Why? Because they have lost public credibility and public trust. So I don't really think we should, I think there's good reason to have oversight and caution and scrutiny and always looking at what they're doing, and if they do something bad, to hammer them. But that's very different than breaking them up. Very different than treating them as a public utility, which would mean essentially much less innovation. So I am not worried. I have a lot of faith in our system, and I don't really see anything that I would worry about, given the fact that I'm benefiting personally as a buyer. And by the way, I'm benefiting personally because Amazon lowered the price of my book. So if you go to Barnes & Noble, they charge a lot more than Amazon. I want my book to be sold. So I think it's actually working just fine. Thank you.
All right, Stacy.
Thank you. I think I need to turn this on.
Yep.
Is this it?
Yep.
There we go. How's that? Well, thank you. It's nice to be here, and thanks for TAC for organizing this. I'm with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. We're on the left, though we have this idea, a couple of ideas at the heart of who we are around community self-determination and the importance of decentralizing power, both economic and political, that I think is in some ways a very conservative idea, so we're sometimes sort of odd ducks among our friends on the left. So, I want to make just a few comments. I want to just start by noting that the way that we pay for Facebook, Google, Amazon, in many ways, our searches and our access to Facebook is through data. It's with giving them access to our data. We also pay for it in loss of income and opportunity in our economy, and the chance of the range of jobs that are available to us, the level of economic activity in our communities. We pay for it with an increasing concentration geographically, a handful of metros that are doing well, and lots of the country that is being left behind. We pay for it with a loss of community self-determination, with a surveillance state delivered by private actors that isn't very democratic. I think it's easy, and we should be mindful in the context of all of the technological advances that have come along in recent decades, that it's very easy for the people who are benefiting from this kind of centralization of power and tech to try to convince us to conflate the technological progress and advantages and conveniences that we've all gotten with their power. There's a difference between those things. We can have online shopping and interaction and great search and all those other things without turning over control of our economy and our society to a handful of giants, right? So that's not a defense of these companies. So I also, I spent a lot of time thinking about Amazon and writing about Amazon, so I want to just take a few minutes to talk specifically about Amazon in the context of these questions. It's hard to think of a company, there are very few companies that have benefited as much from government favors as this company has. And that's partly because of the kind of ideological shift that happened in US economic and competition policy beginning in the 1970s and 1980s. We radically sort of changed how we approach antitrust. And a consequence of that is that Amazon has been allowed to grow using tactics that before would have drawn scrutiny and enforcement. And the most obvious of these is predatory pricing, below cost selling. So, in the first 6 years that Amazon was in business, they lost $3 billion selling books and other goods at a loss. A lot of their competitors in that space just didn't have the financial resources to sustain those kinds of losses over that period, and they disappeared. And today, Amazon sells a majority of books, and they've continued to use that kind of below-cost selling strategy again and again throughout their history, whether it was when an upstart competitor named Zappos came along, they sold shoes at a loss, lost $150 million. And finally Zappos said, we are bleeding red, we're happy to let you take us over. This is a strategy for controlling markets, and it is not something that we police or prosecute anymore. So part of how Amazon got here is this sort of ideology of efficiency above all else, and obviously big companies are inevitably more efficient, and therefore we shouldn't worry about actually having competition anymore, about keeping markets open and fair, and threw that out the window. But it's not just this sort of larger context, it's so many other advantages as well. Amazon's founder, Jeff Bezos, he has made securing government favors a core part of his business strategy from the very beginning. And the reason he located Amazon in 1995 in Washington State and not in the Bay Area, as he told Fast Company magazine at the time, was he didn't want to have to collect sales tax in the populous state of California. And so he'd be a little bit up the coast in Washington. Not having to collect sales tax on online orders has been an incredible advantage. For most of its 23 years in business, Amazon has not been required to collect tax in most states. As recently as 2016, it was not collecting in nearly 20 states. And today, it still doesn't collect sales tax on the third-party sales, the marketplace sales that happen on its site. That's about half of its business. And it might be easy to think, well, that's just sort of on the margins, but this really matters. It's been a huge competitive advantage. There was a study done by 3 economists at Ohio State University. They used credit card data from 2.7 million households for the years 2011 to 2015. And they found that households in states that went to requiring Amazon to collect sales tax, purchases of items valued at $250 or more dropped 30% in those households, and nearly 10% for everything else. And this is 2011 to 2015, when Amazon already has all these bells and whistles and advantages that out there in the marketplace. Just imagine how much that sales tax advantage mattered in the 1990s and the 2000s. It is a huge part, and we can look to Amazon's own behavior. The way it has carefully skirted sales tax and avoided it, the fact that it printed up fake business cards for its employees. This was in the Wall Street Journal, because it feared when those employees went to states where it didn't have nexus for sales tax, that their presence there would trigger a requirement to collect sales tax. And a very huge tax avoidance strategy, because Amazon knows that it matters to its bottom line. And it's hard, today the Supreme Court ruled that states have the authority to require remote sellers to collect sales tax. After 23 years, it's a pretty late decision, and remarkable that it took us this long. I can't help but thinking back to the kinds of retailers, the kinds of competitive online marketplace that we might have had. I'm thinking about a lot of the independent retailers that, naturally, when they went online. I'm thinking about a travel store in California, for example. I knew they had a website before Amazon did. They were early adopters of e-commerce. They had a really aggressive strategy about that. And because they're a local business, most of their customers online and off were inevitably local. So they had to collect sales tax right from the beginning, back in the 1990s. Their competitor didn't. You talk to business owners like that about what it's like at the cash register when you have to add 9% onto a sale and your biggest competitor does not. It's a huge thing. This has driven a lot of Amazon's growth over the years. As it grew, Amazon also began to develop other strategies. Beginning around 2005, it realized as it was growing its warehouses, it could collect subsidies. It could go out to cities and say, we want to build a warehouse in your location, give us a big tax break or subsidy. We looked at 10 years worth of data, all the warehouses Amazon built between 2005 and 2014, and found that more than half of them received public subsidies. Good Jobs First has tallied these up. It's over $1.2 billion in public subsidies that have gone to Amazon. Small businesses don't have access to those kinds of things. And now, of course, Amazon has developed this incredible internal economic development team. The sweepstakes for HQ2 is just stunning. Maryland's put $8.5 billion on the table That's more than the headquarters is going to cost to build, right? And you know, the biggest financial advantage of the sweepstakes may not even be the money. It may be that Amazon has engineered this incredible PR event where it has mayors from all of these cities standing up and saying Amazon's further growth is not something to be worried about, it is something to be fervently wished for, and that your dollars should be used to subsidize. I mean, how much is that worth at a moment when scrutiny of the company's power is just beginning to happen? How much is it worth to have Bill de Blasio and all of these people asking for Amazon to come to their city? You know, and it goes on. It's at the federal level. In 2016, Amazon hired Ann Rung. She held top positions in the Obama administration in procurement. A little more than a year later, Congress passes a law directing GSA, the General Service Administration, to solicit proposals for an e-commerce portal to supply federal agencies with commercial goods. So that's worked out for them. And I want to just transition to sort of a final set of comments on this by noting that as Amazon has been positioning itself to win this contract to be the e-commerce portal through which federal government purchasing goes, to be the interface for purchasing of commercial goods across the federal government, and it's working to get that business right now. As it's been doing that, it's been saying to government buyers, to GSA, it's like, well, you don't worry about all the other businesses. They can just become sellers on our platform. This is what it's saying. All of these compete. You can still do business with X, Y, and Z, these other companies. They can just become sellers on our platform. And this ultimately is what Amazon is about. It's not about being a retailer. Amazon is about controlling the interface through which commerce happens, becoming the kind of infrastructure of the economy. Amazon already captures 1 out of every $2 that Americans spend online. It sells more books, clothing, toys, and electronics than any other retailer, online or off. And most crucially, more than half of product searches now start not at a search engine, but on Amazon's platform. And what that means, 55% of all people, when they want to buy something online, they're not going to a search engine, they're starting right on Amazon. What that means is that every other company that manufactures or retails goods and wants to reach consumers has little choice but to become a seller on that platform. What does that mean for them? It means giving up 15% of their revenue or more off the top to Amazon. It means allowing Amazon to use the data it gathers about them and their customers to compete against them. You know, how have these companies abused their powers? I mean, I can introduce you to a lot of retailers, a lot of manufacturers who, you know, suddenly found that their account on Amazon was suspended overnight for no reason, and the company won't return their emails or calls. Sellers who suddenly found that they've been reduced in the search ranking because Amazon's decided to manufacture a knockoff of their product and put it in the first results of the search ranking. And on it goes. The idea here is that Amazon is not, they're re-engineering us away from a kind of open, competitive market, a true market, a public market, to a kind of private arena where they control the flow of goods. They can decide we want to privilege our own goods and services on these pipelines that we own. And for the stuff that we don't really want to deal with, we'll let other companies do that, and then we'll levy a kind of tax on their trade. And I use the word tax deliberately because I think the very first point that Matt made about private government is really at the heart of what's going on here. This is about having a governing power, an autocrat over commerce, a governing power over trade, and a power that really extends directly to our communities. It's the power to decide the fate of who wins and loses, not only among businesses, but among places, where jobs are going to be created and all the places where they're not going to be created, what places are going to get to have businesses and not have businesses. So the stakes of this question, I think, are extraordinarily high. Thanks.
Thanks so much for all those vigorously expressed views. To kind of kick off the open-ended part of our discussion, which I'm excited about, a couple of questions I want to pose to our panelists. First, for the 3 or maybe 2.5, I'm not really sure if I can lump Tim in with Stacy and Matt. who think there is some kind of problem with the status quo with big tech and crony capitalism. Maybe if we could just get a sense of if there was one thing, either via legislation or an agency regulated regulation related to big tech, that if you could wave a magic wand to try to ameliorate the problem you've described, maybe you could just tell us what that is. I'm curious in terms of moving towards kind of practical solutions. I mean, maybe for Tim, it would simply just be don't let the companies write the regulations. But and then for Robert, who I think has basically expressed we shouldn't really be worried about the status quo. Maybe you could just respond to some of the things that Matt and Stacy have expressed. Is Amazon more than just a kind of retail outlet? Is it a kind of common carrier type platform like the railroads or Ma Bell? I assume you think it's not. If it's not, why is it not? It seems like there's maybe a fairly strong case to be made that it is a different kind of animal than just a regular retail outlet, I think, as Stacy has expressed rather well. Maybe you could just respond to that and give us your sense of that. So I don't know where we want to start, but the floor is open. Matt?
I mean, there's no silver bullet for this, so this is not there's not one policy choice here, because these companies are a result of many policy choices over 40 years from both Democrats and Republicans. But if there were one thing I would like to see happen, I would like to see a series of reviews and of mergers that these companies have engaged in, and reverse spin-offs of these mergers. Because one of the things to understand about Google, Facebook, and Amazon is that they are not actually, they weren't companies that started in their garage and grew to become very large. They are holding companies. So Facebook is not, people conflate Facebook with the product Facebook, but Facebook is a holding company of Instagram, of WhatsApp, of Messenger, of Inavo, of a series of ad tech companies. Same thing with Google. It's YouTube, it's Keyhole, which is Google Maps, it's AdMob, it's DoubleClick. Same thing with Amazon. And so these guys bought their way into their market positions. So the antitrust agencies have merger authority. The Clayton Act exists. They haven't really been enforcing it. So, but they do have the legal authority to look back at these mergers and undo them. And so I would that's one thing that they could do. And I think if you did take Facebook and divided out Instagram and divided out WhatsApp, you would at least reduce the power that Mark Zuckerberg has over every single press outlet in this country.
Great. So Tim, anything that government can or should do in this arena, or just stay out of the way?
It would all be, at this point, not things. In other industries, I would talk about lots of favors that need to be rolled back. Most of what I was saying was that I'm worried about the favors they're going to get. I would say every state should withdraw, and every city and every county should withdraw its billion or $100 million subsidies, and let Amazon pay for its own parking lot and its own office building.
Stacy, you want to go next, and then we'll finish with Robert?
Sure. I mean, I think at the heart of the tech companies is a role that they play as mediators for the rest of the economy. So there's a kind of common carrier situation here that needs some sort of regulatory framework that allows for fairness. I have a hard time, in the case of Amazon, which I've thought a lot about, and I don't know if this is true of the others, imagining that we need anything less than a kind of structural separation between Amazon as a retailer and increasingly a manufacturer of goods, and Amazon as a platform that other retailers rely on. So I think that's really the center of what needs to happen.
So that's a bunch of things I could respond to from. Let me try to be quick. Just responding to Tim. There's no. What I find interesting is there's all this assumption that big tech is all powerful. You just look at spending on lobbying, they're not even in the top 10 industries. I mean, they're industries that vastly outspend tech on lobbying. Secondly, if they're all so powerful, and by the way, I can tell you, the last thing they want is regulation. If they want regulation, why were they the most active opponents of GDPR in Europe, which is a terrible bill, by the way, a terrible law. It's going to set back European innovation forever. Why would they oppose that? If they're so powerful, why did they lose what was called the SESTA bill, the Stop Online Sex Trafficking Act? They should have all power. They should be able to tell these members of Congress exactly what to do. They lost that miserably. You know, if they want more regulation, why are they fighting changes in intermediary liability? So the notion that somehow that they are all powerful and want regulation to hinder and put in a straitjacket their competitors, I just don't buy it. This notion somehow that Stacy was talking about, and a little bit with Matt, I think we have to remember what is the goal of antitrust. The European antitrust regime is sort of trying to balance producer welfare and consumer welfare. The American regime has rightly been about consumer welfare. I fundamentally don't care about some travel agent in California. Okay, that's what's called capitalism. Capitalism is you put your money down, you try to do the best you can, and if you lose, I don't care. What I care about is having companies compete effectively to be able to give me the lowest prices and the highest quality. And I don't see any evidence, given the fact that people are increasingly shopping on Amazon. How many people here, by the way, are being forced to shop on Amazon? All right, I don't know what your problem is. Your wife probably. By the way, another interesting, again, going back to facts, Amazon is not even in the top 4 retailers in the U.S. It's not even in the top 4, okay? So it's number 5. And if you look at the top 4 retailers, their total retail market share is not very high. Secondly, second to last on that, you know, maybe Amazon at some point in time will start marking up my book to $40 because they have such monopoly power and they're trying to screw consumers and screw me at the same time. But right now, they're charging $15. By the way, that's a really good price, $15. $15. Okay, so I'm happy to keep taking that. In the long run, as Keynes said, we're all dead. I'm not worried about predatory pricing because I don't see any evidence. Last thing on the political part that Stacy alluded to, if Amazon is wanting to avoid taxes, why did it support the I can't remember the name of the bill, there were different ones, Market Street Fairness or Main Street Fairness. Why did they oppose that bill why did they support that bill 5 or 6 years ago? And that was a bill that would have put taxes on internet retailers. Why did they cheer when the South Dakota the bill, the Supreme Court Wayfair came out today? So this notion that Amazon is doing all this. Last point is, we don't want the federal government to be buying from an e-commerce portal because we really like the way the GSA buying system works. Where, oh, by the way, if these companies are so all-powerful, why are there very large procurement set-asides for small businesses? Because if you're a taxpayer, I guarantee you are paying more in taxes because of these procurement set-asides. If small businesses could compete fairly on the marketplace, you wouldn't have government procurement set-asides. Talk about crony capitalism. That is crony capitalism. Oh, we can't compete, we can't compete. Because why can't you compete? Because your costs aren't good enough, your quality might not be good enough, because you don't have economies of scale. So I just think the whole sort of argument that somehow this is a big crisis. I'm enjoying the crisis, I got to tell you, because I get free web searches, I get to talk to my daughter, and I get really cheap prices on Amazon, and they're charging a lot less for my book.
I'd like to just jump in on that tax thing. I think that's another great example of Amazon lobbying for and profiting from big government, which is that they did a good job of avoiding sales taxes for a while, but as lower courts started to rule that Quill, which is a precedent that got killed today, but the idea was if you had a physical presence in a state, you then had to collect a sales tax, and then courts started to rule, well, wait a second, this warehouse network you're building, Amazon, that's a physical presence, and so you do have to collect taxes. in Oklahoma, and you do have to collect taxes in New York for sales taxes in these states where you have a physical presence. So once Amazon got to the point where it was being forced by the courts to collect the taxes, what did it do? It flipped from opposing the Marketplace Fairness Act or whatever to supporting it. Suddenly you had Walmart and Amazon on the same side saying, yes, every online retailer should have to collect these taxes. Oh, and by the way, we, Amazon, we might be able to provide you a service that helps you deal with the 10,000 different taxing jurisdictions. They wanted big government, not through regulation specifically, but through taxes, through the complexity of state and local sales taxes. They wanted big government to help kill their competitors who couldn't handle the added overhead of processing this. But on the regulation front, all these big guys, and here I'm probably the only guy who opposed it, all these big guys wanted the net neutrality regulation. And again, you had Zuckerberg saying, yes, regulate us, and thank you, Senator Graham. I will be happy to write these regulations that will kill our smaller competitors.
Just,
net neutrality. If they're all powerful and they get net neutrality, which, by the way, net neutrality was not about regulating them. It was about ensuring that that ISPs wouldn't block.
It was about mandating their current business profit model.
And if they're so powerful about that, why do we not have net neutrality?
Well, and this is where I think you're right. I think this is you made the good point. The $19 million that Amazon or that Google spends on lobbying isn't as much as pharma, and the guys who spend them more are the telecoms, and they won the net neutrality in part because they spend more, but in part because in a Republican administration, in this case, the smaller government argument won out over the bigger government argument. So they aren't all powerful. They are an industry that is that has a lot of clout.
And I just want to make one point. Wait. I just want to say that
telecoms are lobbying right now to get congressional legislation passed for net neutrality.
Wait, can I?
You guys can't have it both ways. Amazon's not wanting taxes, now they are wanting.
Hang on, I just want to.
Let's do a little fact check.
Let's do Stacy.
I just want to say one
Matt,
thing, which is let's just clear something up. Google is the #1 spender in DC on lobbying.
That's right.
Okay, #1. All right, and it is.
I was talking about industries, which is what you were talking about.
Well, yeah, but other industries aren't as concentrated. Is Matt's point here that Google is and their investment in the revolvers and all that. I mean, they are a massive spender on lobbying, and yeah.
Just on the fact-checking points here, because I think this is important. Amazon did not support the Marketplace Fairness Act. That's not in fact true. They supported a federal solution, they said, and then used that position to undermine that legislation. I mean, that's the lobbying history that happened around that. Amazon does not, Amazon is in a lawsuit right now in South Carolina because South Carolina has said you need to be collecting sales tax for all the third-party sales. You need to be collecting sales tax for half of the business on your platform that you're delivering into our state. You're liable for that. So why, Amazon is spending an enormous amount of money to fight South Carolina on that. They have gone to great lengths in a number of states, including my own, where they don't have a physical presence. They said, okay, well, we'll collect on our own direct sales, but we won't collect for our platform sales. We'll negotiate this deal. We'll collect on our direct sales if you give us not having to collect on the platform. So they continue to find ways to fight and to avoid sales tax. The idea that they were in favor of a fair playing field is really a misrepresentation of the lobbying history of what was a very clever move to actually avoid having that legislation
They were
passed.
in favor of national legislation.
Yeah, they were not actually in favor of real legislation. They were in favor of being able to say we're in favor of legislation, thus to be at the table and to be in the media in ways that actually prevented real legislation from being able to pass. I think on the notion that Amazon doesn't have market power and is this kind of tiny force out there, I mean, it's really remarkable that every time they even sort of sneeze in the direction of an industry, that all the other companies in that industry's stock value plummets. I mean, nobody else recognizes them as a minor player. I mean, this is just not true. We need to be having a conversation about what the implications of their power are, not sort of trying to minimize what it is, because it's obvious that they have it.
We're running short of time, and I want to make sure we have time for our audience to get some questions in before we keep this debate going at our reception. So let's take some questions from the audience. Gentleman over here, first in the black shirt. Sorry, Emil, for making you sprint to the other side of the
I just want to make a point about a monopoly in general and what we're really talking about here. Because when people rebelled against the British East Indies Company, it's not because they said the price of tea is too high. That wasn't the complaint. They were complaining, we were complaining, that the British were taking away our liberties by monopolizing a market and preventing Americans from coming to market and interchanging their goods and ideas and crops with one another. It was an infringement on their freedom, and that's what we're talking about. Now, Rob's main point is look at all this stuff that you're getting. And I can argue with him about whether there's actually, I guess without American Airlines, we wouldn't have flight, that's the essential argument he's making. But the real question here is, are we a free people? Or, as even Rob's acknowledged, are we just trusting Mark Zuckerberg to do the right thing?
Okay, question from the audience.
More practical question, given that we're here in Washington. If you were in Congress, or say running for Congress, what would you suggest, just if you were to put it out in a tweet, what would you suggest would be the best way to, what kind of bill or whatever would reduce the power, or at least do some shifts of Amazon, for example, the main subject here, Google and or Facebook?
I would make it illegal for members of Congress or senators to become lobbyists for any company, and after they leave, and put longer cooling off periods on top staff, and apply it to cabinet members as well. And that's not a tech specific thing. That applies to all industries. I think the revolving door is, again, 85% of, what was it? I had a majority of all three of those companies, and 85% of Facebook's lobbyists are former staffers, 81% of Google's. Amazon has 2 senators and 2 congressmen on its lobbying payroll. If you squash the revolving door, I think what you do is you level the playing field, because these guys who are writing the bills, they're writing the bills, A, to make themselves more valuable when they cash out, but B, they are lining up their own gigs at these major employers. So the beauty of the market, that it casts down the mighty, can lift up the lowly, that's incredibly stultified when government sticks its fingers into the gears of the market.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Robert Dyer, and I wonder if you could compare the government's antitrust case against IBM that was eventually dropped that led to the rise of Microsoft with the government's case against Microsoft, which the decision came out 17 years ago this month, and that led to the rise of other firms like Facebook and Google and Amazon, because Microsoft and IBM both had to put resources into fighting the government.
Is that to me?
To everybody, but two antitrust cases, 2 different procedures. Reagan dropped one, and one Bill Clinton filed the lawsuit, and yet here we are with the same result.
I think that's revisionist history. I don't think there's any evidence that the Microsoft case, and by the way, the issue on Microsoft, we have to remember, what was the issue on Microsoft? There were 2 issues. There were the issues that I would assume, maybe I should put words in Matt's mouth, but he would object to Microsoft because they were a monopoly. That really wasn't the issue. The issue was conduct, not structure. And there were some conduct issues with Microsoft that were quite legitimate and opened up in terms of how they interacted with other platforms, other software to be able to interact with Windows and the like. So that was fine. When you go back to IBM, then one of the points we make in the book is if you look at the history of U.S. antitrust, particularly in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it did enormous damage to the U.S. technology economy. It single-handedly destroyed RCA and enabled the Japanese television industry to get off the ground. It single-handedly handed 50% of the copier market to the Japanese because we were freaked out because Xerox had so much market share. Yeah, we got more competition, but the Japanese got all the jobs and thriving industry. And that was somewhat true in IBM. It wasn't that the government it wasn't so much the government dropped the case, but they were under review for, what, 17 years? And that was a sort of heavy shadow on IBM that limited their ability to go compete. And it's actually one of the reasons they lost market share to the Japanese mainframe producers. So.
Next question. The gentleman in the red shirt.
I'm concerned about the limitations of choice and homogeneity that your, Mr. Atkinson's comments sort of portend. Recently there was mass shutdowns of internet sites that included fringe groups, terrorists, but also a lot of people that question traditional narratives, such as, let's take, for example, health. A lot of people that had natural health solutions or right to that effect were basically shut down. And is this a backdoor way to channel business into the pharmaceutical industry? The adverse effects from prescription drugs, for example, every year kills 108,000 people on average. And people want other choices, and this kind of limits their choices, it seems to me.
I
mean, that's
may
just
have
one
been
example.
on a website that a lot of people don't go on because that never happened. So this is what I would say is essentially fake news. There was no massive shutdown of websites.
Well, it's your interpretation of fake news.
Or internet companies.
Well, there's killer drugs that have found their way onto the market because of lack of proper scrutiny. Vioxx killed 60,000 people. Januvia, Avandia, Bextra, you can go on and on. People want information and they want this free flow of information in order to make decisions for themselves, not to have monolithic companies make those decisions for them.
Yeah, I guess what I find, first of all, there was no shutdown. And secondly, what I find striking about that comment is, if you look at the amazing amount and diversity of information you get, you want to go online and find out about, vegan people who believe in philosophy, who like to live in California. I guarantee you'll get a whole bunch of people who like that. You get websites. So the idea that somehow we have less information and less diverse information, I think is, to me, that's what the internet has given us. It's given us this vast array of information. Maybe too much because we're all in our own little communities and not talking to one another. But I don't think there's a monoculture of information. It's just the opposite.
I'll just note that one of the most serious crises that we have right now is the crisis of local journalism, local news, which has collapsed because of the monopolization of the ad market, particularly by Google and Facebook. There were other problems as well. I'm not going to say that those businesses were run really well. But one of the things to understand about local news, going back to the Constitutional Convention, the post office was set up as an open access network to facilitate the flow of news. Even in the early 1800s, newspapers were shielded from the power of the state by local advertising, so they wouldn't be dependent on the state. That local ad market is basically dead, or almost dead, for the first time in American history. And so we are in an experiment that is really frightening. So the idea that we have an incredible diversity of news, we have a lot of information that's out there, but we don't have those eyes on every city hall, school board, business, labor union, all over the country that we used to have. And when you don't have people watching for problems, you're going to see a lot of problems crop up, and they're going to seem really surprising and shocking. But if we had had a coherent anti-monopoly strategy to keep the financing of this social endeavor that America's always relied on, we wouldn't be encountering a lot of these problems.
That kind of marketplace diversity, just to add another dimension of it, because I think is really critical, is that, you talk to small and mid-sized manufacturers now. We did a bunch of interviews with folks in the toy industry, for example, and in the apparel industry. And what they talk about, the sort of structure of the industries that they're facing, is that it's becoming increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for them to introduce new products. Because in a world where you have a diversity of retailers, and particularly when you have sort of smaller retailers, and you can start small with a few and build up from there, and then eventually you're in Target and on Amazon, is a world in which you can introduce a new product. And in the context of Amazon, it's the ability to direct attention to a handful of things. Yes, everything is there. It's good for search, but it's not actually good for lifting individual products up, for new products to find a marketplace. And you know, one of the things that I had a toy manufacturer say to me is like, consumers don't even know what they're missing, that isn't getting developed, that isn't finding a home, but it has become so much harder, and it's meant cutbacks for us, it's meant less diversity of an ecology in our industry, and that's all really concerning in the context of toys and apparel and all the other sectors of the economy, but it's really disturbing in the context of books and the ability to mediate ideas. You know, if you're browsing in a local bookstore, you're about 3 times as likely to discover a book that you didn't know about that you'd like to read than if you're shopping on Amazon, according to Codex Group, which tracks this stuff closely. There's a way in which all of these platforms channel our attention to a very narrow range of things. And one of the challenges, I think, as a society of figuring out how to respond to that is that we can't even necessarily see what we're missing. When that diversity starts to disappear, it's not really clear what's missing to us. And I think that's one of the big dangers, as well as the sort of power these companies have as mediators.
So we have time for just one more question. Go ahead, in the back.
It's a question for everybody, but it's really a question, It's a question for everybody, but it's really a question for Mr. Atkinson, because it was the first one I was able to look up. But in the interest of transparency, who are your donors for your organizations? Because Mr. Atkinson, I just looked up yours from an external website, and it says your donors are broad, a lot of diversity. But it includes, amongst Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, others, but also eBay, Google, IBM, the Information Technology Industry Council, Cisco, and the Communications Workers of America.
Yeah, so I think
But the question is for everyone. I just didn't have the chance to look up everybody's because it didn't raise as many alarm bells. But I'm just curious because there seems to be a conflict of interest in this discussion.
Sure. No, I figured this would happen. And my answer is, what about the arguments or the data that I have just presented to you would you like to argue and disagree with?
We could have, and I think your panelists have called out a lot of the
right, and I enjoyed that
facts,
discussion.
and we could have a discussion of Schumpeter and creative destruction and monopoly on and off cycle. But I didn't, like I said, I didn't have a chance to look at the other people's donors, but it did raise some eyebrows with the amount of fact checking stuff that I went to go look it up.
So I actually I have a strong opinion about this, and I do, as a journalist, I do lots of writing about conflicts of interest. Now first, full disclosure, if you go to my Twitter account, there's a link and it lists everybody who I know gives me money. There are nonprofits, and I don't know everybody who gives them money. AEI, my secondary employee, I know has corporate donors, and I'm pretty sure that I beat them up in my columns. But my opinion on your question and Robert's answer, and a partial defense of Robert, when I go after people for having undisclosed conflicts of interest, it's because, well, it's because they argue from authority. So former Senator George Allen, blah, 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 and he says, as a conservative Republican, in this case, I make an exception because this company needs a subsidy, blah. And when they say, I'm arguing and you should listen to me because I'm a conservative, because I'm a retired general and I know what our military needs and it's the F-35, then in all those cases, once they argue from authority, that's when you say, no, here your donors are incredibly relevant. In this case, on this stage, and I haven't read the book, but on this stage, while I disagree with most of what he said, Robert never argued from authority. He never said, you should listen to me because of my past or my PhD or anything like that I remember. And so in that case, I would say, yeah, let's measure his arguments on their merit. So I'm a big believer in looking at people's donors in all cases, but specifically somebody who's not arguing from authority. I agree with Robert's retort here. Argue with the merits of the argument.
So we're funded by.
That would be a conflict of interest. I'm not going to take it.
So we're funded by foundations and individuals. No, we don't take for-profit money, or money from for-profit corporations. But I think that I don't object to corporate funding broadly. If other people take it, but I think that we have a problem with Google and Facebook and Amazon. because what they're doing, and more broadly, I mean, the number of public companies has dropped from 7,000 in 96 to around 3,500 today, largely because of mergers. And one of the things that happens is you just see less diversity of funding. You're never going to get rid of any conflicts, of all conflicts of interest, but you can diversify away from them. And one of the things I think that's really scary is just how many people in DC Google is funding. And I think you see it. So there was a hearing last year where my boss was on a Senate panel to debate the consumer welfare standard on antitrust. And there were people on the left and there were people on the right. And there was like big law people. There was 5 people on the panel to debate it. And if you sat there, you listened to it, you would think, wow, everybody but this one guy seems to think that this one particular standard on how we do antitrust is good. And this one guy seems to be an outlier from the right and the left. But what was interesting is every single one of those people, except for my boss, was being paid by Google or was in some ways funded by Google. And that's what you see over and over and over and over in the privacy space, within academia, within research institutions, a lot of nonprofits. I mean, you know, the American Library Association takes money from Google, and I love librarians. They were the only ones against the Patriot Act. But you really have a problem, and I don't think that everyone is corrupt who takes money, but I think you have to, you know, you have to assume that there's no free lunch here. And that there is a reason that Google and Amazon and Facebook are giving this money. But I'll note one other thing, and the difference between these guys and the traditional sort of donors from the military-industrial complex or other institutions, these guys also have enormous repositories of data that academics really, really want access to. And they can give them access to it pending sort of vetoes over their research or their conclusions. They have power over, think about it as like a railroad into the mind of every American. Like that's the power that these guys have, and they can distribute that even more than money. And I really do worry about that. I think that's a real threat to whether we can remain a free people.
Well, I'm not sure if the university was worried things were going to be out of hand, but there's a policeman now in the back, and maybe that's the time, that's a signal that it's time to wrap things up and move to the reception. I hope you'll join me in thanking all of our panelists today.
Just 2 brief closing remarks. If you like what you heard today or want to continue the conversation, visit us at theamericanconservative.com. And also, please save the date for our fall foreign policy conference, which will be on November 15th. Thank you.